How many of you have heard the illustration about the mouse trap? Now I can't see your hands, but I think there must be some out there. How many of you heard the mouse trap? This is not a mouse trap. I wanted to be different, so I asked Bonnie to find me an egg beater. I don't know where she got this. Do they still make these? Yeah, they do still make them. If you looked at something like this, would you immediately assume that an intelligence produced it? How many would agree? Could you throw bombs at rock for years and never get one of these? No. Hand grenades, it didn't matter. No matter how you arrange the bombs, would they ever produce one of these? No. This required intelligence. The interesting thing about this is it's a combination of 3 or 4 things. You've got a handle, you've got a crank that manipulates the gears to the shafts and the little blenders. I used to use one of these to comb my brother's hair when I was growing up. Now, if you take the handle by itself, does it serve a purpose? If you take the crank and the gears and set it off, if we disassemble this, which would take some work in itself, if you disassemble this and you put the gears off by themselves, would it serve any purpose? What about the blenders? If they're separated by themselves, you could probably still whip eggs, but it wouldn't do what it does when it's combined. This would never evolve. Because in order for it to be what it is, all the pieces have to come together at the same time. The handle would never say, you know, I think I'd be more fulfilled if I had blenders attached to me and develop blenders. If you try to crank the crank without the handle, you get this action. It's like a helicopter without the rotor. It needs all of the different components to work. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. There are millions of examples in nature and creation of things infinitely more complex than a mousetrap or an egg beater that would never evolve, because in order for them to serve their purpose, they would all have to have this need to be together all at one time. You remove any component, it ceases to work. Does that make sense? The cells of life, matter of fact, probably this is a good place to lead into point number 3, symbiotic relationships. We are surrounded in nature with what we would call symbiotic relationships. Insects and flowers. There are many flowers that will not pollinate unless they are pollinated by the proboscis that comes out of the nose of the butterfly. And if you go to the rainforest, there are some orchids that have a funnel that is a foot deep, and there is a moth that just so happens to have a proboscis that unwinds that far, and he only pollinates that orchid. What are the chances of an orchid surviving for millions of years, not being able to be pollinated until a moth happens to develop the ability to pollinate that orchid? They would have to happen simultaneously. The food in your stomach is being digested because we have a symbiotic relationship with certain microbes and bacteria. They're called friendly bacteria. Are you aware of that? And that's why sometimes if you've been sick and you taking antibiotics, they tell you ought to eat some yogurt. You know what you're doing? You're reintroducing some of those friendly bacteria, a culture where they can grow, to bring your digestion back where it's supposed to be. The relationship between bees and the flowers. And there are relationships between sea anemones and clownfish. And the little clownfish are immune to the poisonous touch of the anemones. And they keep the anemones clean, and vice versa. They scrub each other. And there are fish that open their mouth and other fish go inside. And there are birds that clean the ticks off the backs of rhinoceroses. And all throughout nature, there are fungus and trees that have these relationships that would only exist if they developed simultaneously. It could never have evolved that way. Then, of course, you've got something that's called the law of entropy. Evolution operates on the basis that things are getting better. But now I didn't say the theory of entropy. It's the law of entropy, which is the inevitable and steady deterioration of a system or society from order to disorder. Everything we observe in the world today, anything left to itself without outside energy being put into it, without intelligence being added to it, it falls apart. If you see a beautifully landscaped yard in gardens and flowers, and the owner of the house dies, and it is not kept, what happens? It goes to weed, and the grass starts to grow, and the paint begins to peel, and it all begins to implode over time. And that is a very simple fact that can be seen all through nature. Anything left to itself will begin to deteriorate, to work its way down. Evolution is teaching the exact opposite of what we scientifically observe in the universe. The orbit of the moon around the earth is slowing. It's not speeding up. Matter of fact, it's slowly spiraling further out from the earth every year. And I forget what it is. It's in 1,000 years, it's 800 feet or something like that. It gets further out. And that works in the scenario of the earth being young, 6,000 years old. You can have the moon going out every 1,000 years, 800 feet, and still be in its orbit. But based on that scenario and those measurements, if the earth has been here for billions of years, the moon would have been rubbing against the earth based on that spiral. And just everything we see in the galaxies around us and what they call the expanding universe, things are not getting better, they're breaking down. They were started by the Lord during creation, but evolution is teaching that things are somehow spiraling up and getting better. Then you've got what we would call the flood of evidence. When you look around the world, and I saw it again just last week. This is one of the reasons that made me think of it. We drove by Pyramid Lake, which is over there in Nevada. And you could see where at one time on the strata in the hillsides surrounding the lake, there are lines. You could take a level with a transit, put it in the ground, and you could follow that line on the hillsides. It would be perfectly level. You know why? Because water always levels itself in our world. The water had been at a much higher level at one time. And I have been in New Mexico and seen places where you're 8,000 feet up in the mountains, and there's seashells everywhere as far as you could see. You could just dig them out of the hills. The dinosaur bones and the bones and the fossils that we find around the world. You know how you get the multitude of fossils that you find around the world? There had to be some cataclysm that caused a tremendous flood, because the way you get fossils is all this mud and silt covers something quickly, and it dies, and it is pressed down, and it leaves the impression. You don't get fossils when something dies and lays on the surface of the ground and blows away. It must be covered. Otherwise, if a person dies or an animal dies and it lays on the surface of the earth, insects, decomposition, animals of carrion, they break it apart and they carry it off, and you don't get a fossil. It must be covered quickly by mud. For years, the scientists tried to say, well, how did the evolutionary scientists, how did the dinosaurs die off? And they had all these theories of disease, changes in the atmosphere. And finally, they had to come to the conclusion, we found all these fossils in great heaps together, covered with silt. They obviously died in some cataclysmic flood. They could not deny it any longer. The evidence was so overwhelming. So you know what they said? Instead of saying, well, maybe there was a worldwide flood like the Bible says, they said, an asteroid must have hit the earth and caused a flood and buried all the dinosaurs. Have you heard this before? They're trying to find a way to get around the Bible account and still account for the fact that there's obviously been a global flood. Everywhere you look in the world is the evidence. Everywhere I've been in the world, I've seen the evidence firsthand with my own eyes. One of the things that turned me from being an evolutionist to a creationist was when I was living in this canyon in Southern California. And I could see evidence of high water, and this is an 11,000-foot mountain. I could see evidence of high water way up in those mountains, and I thought, I was reading the Bible at the same time that there really was a global flood. Now, I was one of those people who first tried to take my evolutionary beliefs and mix them with the Bible, and I said, well, those 7 days of creation really were probably ages. Now, have you run into Christians that believe that? They try to they don't want to be embarrassed, because evolutionists love to scowl and look down upon people who believe in creation as though they're ignorant. Don't be intimidated by that. You have nothing to be ashamed of. The lack of evidence is on the side of the evolutionists. They have the burden of proof. You cannot show from scientific observation an example of organization and design and interworking systems coming from chaos anywhere that is observable in the universe. You cannot, and this is for me a slam dunk, if they believe that life began spontaneously without any intelligent input or assistance, then why can't any of the scientists or evolutionists anywhere in the world produce one single example of a cell of life being produced by a scientist? Can we manipulate life? Oh yeah, we can do in vitro, and we can do test tubes, and we can do all kinds of things where we take the life that God has made and manipulate it. But can we produce a single cell of life no matter what kind of laboratory environment we create? They have not been able to do it once, and yet they say it happened all over the world. Really? That's not very scientific. If it's scientific, show me. Now, can I show you where God created? No. But I can prove that you don't get intelligent systems and order and design from chaos. That is something. If you look at a car, one thing you know is somewhere there's a car maker. Am I right? And there have been many evolutionists who have been overwhelmed by the evidence. They look at a painting, they know there's an artist. They look at the book, they know there's an author. You cannot have intelligent creation and design without intelligence cooperating with that. Then, of course, you've got the living fossils that are an embarrassment. I did an amazing fact about this a little while ago. For years, they had these fossils of these fish that are called coelacanths. You've got one of them there on the screen. They were believed to be extinct. 65 million years was the date they put on the fossil. 65 million years. That's a long time. That's in writing. 1938. Someone fished one up near Indonesia. And I've got pictures there of someone swimming with a living example of a coelacanth. They are very rare. You only find them in the oceans around Indonesia. But and they used to say they were proof for how the fish walked out on land. They said this is one of the missing links. The coelacanth, those are called proto-legs. See the fins? They said those are proto-legs. They're developing feet. Well, 65 million years later, they're still swimming with them just the same way. They never did learn how to walk. Matter of fact, they're in very deep oceans and they have no desire to walk. You try to get them to walk and they die. So it's a desperate attempt to believe something. Then you've got the horseshoe crab. And horseshoe crab, they say, is a living fossil because they find fossils and they say that they are, 150 million years old, and yet the fossils which you see on the screen, and a living one. I used to live on the Atlantic seaboard. You can see them. They all swarm up on the beach. How many of you have seen horseshoe crabs? Lived on the East Coast. They swarm up. They're a real menace, too. Kind of creepy when they crawl. They fall over on their back. But the fossils they've got that they said are 150 million years old are identical to the modern ones. And it is a real mystery why horseshoe crabs have what they call a primitive eye. How come it didn't get any more advanced if evolution is true? Why did they stop right at horseshoe crab? And a number of other examples. People will say the sharks are one of the most, they're living fossils because they've remained virtually unchanged for so many years. And what else? The alligator is a living fossil. And of course the clams have not changed in millions of years because they're found in all different strata. Let me share something with you that evolutionists don't want you to know. During the global flood, when creatures die, different kinds of creatures, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, bodies have different gases and density. They will sink and float at different times. In other words, suppose that you were to take a dozen lizards and a dozen mice, throw them in an aquarium, drown them all, observe them. You'll see that the lizards will sink first, days before the mice bloat and float to the top. The lizards will sink first. They will get covered by sediment first. The reason the dinosaurs are found deeper, at deeper levels, is because they were reptiles. They sank. They were covered by silt sooner than the mammals had floated. They are found at different levels. It is something that is observable scientifically today. But they say that these fossils are millions of years old. You know how they date many of the fossils? Listen carefully. I'm getting ahead of myself. They date the fossils based on the strata of Earth where they find them. If they're deeper, they're older. Do you know how they date the strata of Earth, the layers of Earth? Based on the fossils. Are you listening carefully? You ask them, so how do we date these strata? Well, it's based on the fossils that we found there. So how do we date the fossils? Based on the strata, where we find them. It's circular reasoning. Talk about a desperate effort to try to prove something that isn't true. Now, here is where a lot of people get confused. Do I